In the final days of Hermann Göring, the once powerful National Socialist leader faced the twilight of his life at the Nuremberg Tribunal, subjected to brutal interrogations seeking to unravel his role in Hitler's regime. Hermann Göring, according to the prisoner's psychiatrist, Dr. Douglas Kelly, was considered the most physically fit man in Germany. He was docile and accepted his misfortune with dignity, focusing on preserving the prestige of his authority and securing a place in the history of his country. Göring never considered himself a criminal and, full of pride, declared, "Yes, I will be hanged, I am prepared. But I am determined to go down in German history as a great man. If I cannot convince the tribunal, in the end I will convince the German people that everything I did was for the great German Reich." In 50 or 60 years there will be statues of Hermann Göring all over Germany. The questioning of Hermann Göring by the defense regarding the transcript of the proceedings of the International Military Tribunal, 13th to 18th March 1946.
With the permission of the High Court, I request that the former Reichsmarschall, the defendant Hermann Göring, be called to testify.
Please state your name.
Hermann Göring.
Repeat after me the following oath. I swear by God, the omnipotent and omniscient, that I speak a clear truth and will not hide or add anything.
I swear by God, the omnipotent and omniscient, that I speak a clear truth and will not hide or add anything.
If you wish, you may sit down.
When and where were you born?
I was born on January 12, 1893, in Rosenheim, Bavaria.
Please tell the court about the period of your life before the outbreak of the World War, but please do so briefly.
Ordinary education, first as a home teacher, then a cadet corps, then officer service. Several points were especially important for my later development. My father was the first governor of Southwest Africa. At that time, he had connections with Cecil Rhodes and the elder Chamberlain, then my father's attachment to Bismarck, the experience of my youth, half of which I spent in Austria. I already felt an attachment to it and its kindred people. When the World War broke out, I served as a lieutenant in an infantry regiment.
At what rank did he serve in World War I?
As I just said, I was first a lieutenant in an infantry regiment during the so-called Battle of the Border. From October 1914, I served as an altitude adjuster. In June 1915, I became a pilot, first of a reconnaissance aircraft, then for a short time of a bomber, and in the autumn of 1915, I became a fighter pilot. I was severely wounded in an air battle. After my recovery, I became commander of a fighter squadron, and after Richthofen's death, I became commander of the famous Richthofen Squadron.
What awards have you received?
First, the Iron Cross Second Class, then the Iron Cross First Class, the Zeringen Lion with Swords, the Order of Karl Friedrich, the Hohenzollern with Swords Third Class, and finally the Order of Pour le Mérite, which was the highest honour.
Tell the court when and under what circumstances you met Hitler.
First of all, I would like to draw attention to the following. After the collapse of the First World War, I had to demobilize my squadron. I refused to serve in the Reichswehr because I had been an opponent of the republic that had emerged as a result of the revolution from the beginning. Such service would have been contrary to my convictions. I soon went abroad to find something to do. But after a few years, I decided to return. At first, I spent my time in the hunting lodge studying there. I was looking for a way to get involved in the problems of my country. At the same time, I could not and did not want to serve as an officer for the reasons stated above. To lay the foundation for my future endeavours, I enrolled at the University of Munich to study history and political science. I settled in the outskirts of Munich and bought a house for my wife. One Sunday afternoon in October or November 1922, when another demand from the Entente to extradite our military leaders became known, there was a protest. I attended this meeting only as a spectator, without taking any part in its organisation. There were many speakers from different parties. Towards the end, Hitler was invited to speak. I'd already heard about him, and now I wanted to hear what he had to say in person. He refused to speak, and it was pure chance that I was there when he gave his reasons for refusal. I did not want to disturb the unanimity of the crowd. I did not think it possible to join the chorus of these puppets of the bourgeois pirates. I considered it useless to organize protests as long as they did not have sufficient support. This made a deep impression on me, and I was of the same opinion. I learned that I would be able to hear Hitler speak on the following Monday evening, as he held rallies every Monday evening. I went there, and there Hitler spoke about the events of the demonstration, about Versailles, the Treaty of Versailles, the denunciation of Versailles. He said empty protests like Sundays were pointless. They only distracted from the real agenda, from the fact that a protest is only valid when it has real support. As long as Germany is not strong, such protests are aimless. This conviction coincided word for word with my position. A few days later, I went to the headquarters of the NSDAP. At that time, I knew nothing about the party's program, only that it was a small party. I also looked for other parties. When there were elections to the National Assembly for completely apolitical reasons, I voted for the Democrats. Then, when I realized who I had voted for, I avoided politics for a while. Now, however, I saw a man who had a clear and definite purpose. To begin with, I wanted to talk to him and offer my help. He accepted me immediately, and after my introduction, declared that our meeting was a sign of fate. We immediately began to talk to him about things very close to our hearts, about the defeat of the fatherland, and the fact that we could not reconcile ourselves with it. The main topic of conversation was the discussion of Versailles. I told him that I was at his complete disposal, and that I would do my best and take advantage of every opportunity to work on the most important and decisive issue, in my opinion, the fight against the Treaty of Versailles. The second point which impressed me very much, and which I felt very deeply and really considered the basic condition, was the fact that he explained to me in detail that it was impossible under present conditions to cooperate only with elements which proclaimed themselves national, whether they were the so-called national political parties or those which called themselves nationalists, or individual clubs, militant organizations like the Freikorps, etc. Only with them was it impossible to begin the restoration of a strong national will, as long as the masses of German workers were opposed to the idea. Only he who attracted the masses of German workers behind him could win. This idea could only gain support if the masses realized the need to free themselves from the intolerable shackles of the Versailles Treaty, and this was only possible by combining a nationalist concept and social objectives. He explained to me the beautiful and profoundly valid concept of National Socialism, an amalgamation of two concepts, nationalism on the one hand and socialism on the other, which should have convinced the true supporters of nationalism that socialism is also nationalism. If I may put it that way, the world of the bourgeoisie and the world of Marxist socialism. We had to clarify these conceptions and, by uniting the two ideas, create a new means for the realization of these designs. We now come to the practical side of the matter, concerning whom he asked me in the first place to support his point of view. Within the party, small as it was, he selected men who were staunch supporters and who were ready at any moment to devote themselves completely and irrevocably to the objectives of spreading the message. He told me to be aware of how strong Marxism and communism were then, and that he was faced with the necessity of countering physical violence at meetings by force alone. For this purpose he had created the SA. The leaders were too young, and he had long wished to find a leader who had distinguished himself in the recent war and had the necessary authority. He had long been trying to find a pilot or submariner who had been decorated with the Pour le Mérite, and now, with my arrival, he considered it a special stroke of luck that I was the last commander of the Richthofen squadron to report for service. I said that it would not suit me to assume a leadership position immediately, as it might appear that I had come only for a position. We finally decided that for a month or two I would remain in the shadows, and only then assume leadership, but that I would strive to use my influence immediately. I agreed and became an associate of Adolf Hitler.
When did it happen?
Late October or early November 1922.
At the end of October.
Late October or early November 1922.
And then you officially joined the party?
Yes, it was on the same date. A few days later I joined.
What tasks did Hitler give you, say, before November 1923?
The tasks were derived from my position, which at that time was called Commander of the SA. At first it was important to make the SA a stable organization, to discipline it and to make it a reliable unit capable of carrying out my orders or those of Adolf Hitler at any time. Before, it was a kind of club of very active people, which lacked the necessary organization and discipline. From the beginning, I tried to attract to the SA those party members who were young and idealistic enough, and who were willing to devote their time and resources to the fight against terrorism. Things were not easy for these brave men then. We were few in number, and the enemies were far more numerous. Even in those days, they were already facing and suffering all sorts of things. Secondly, I began to look for new additions to the work environment, as I was confident that I could attract many of them. At the same time, of course, we saw that the party rallies, which were largely confined to Munich, Upper Bavaria and Franconia, were carried out satisfactorily and trouble was avoided. In most cases, we were successful, but sometimes we came up against strong groups of our adversaries. Both sides had surplus weapons from the war, sometimes critical situations arose, and in some cases we had to send SA units as reinforcements for local organizations. During 1923, the differences between Bavaria and the Reich were becoming more and more pronounced. Anyone could see that the Bavarian government was trying to pursue a different policy from the Reich government. The Reich government was infected with Marxism, whereas the Bavarian government was free of it. It was bourgeois. Suddenly, the Bavarian government was completely replaced. When the Governor-General, I think that's what he was called, or something like that. It was von Kahr who was accountable and to whom the Bavarian government delegated its authority. Shortly afterwards, a conflict arose in the Reichswehr. The 7th Reichswehr Division, stationed in Bavaria, was released from its oath to the Reich, which it had sworn on the Reich Constitution, i.e. von Kahr. This led to a conflict between Generals von Seeckt and Lossow. The same occurred with the Bavarian police. At the same time, the Bavarian government enjoyed the confidence of the so-called national associations, which were partly composed of military or paramilitary formations, also in possession of arms. On the whole, they were opposed to Berlin and, as we have said, against the November Republic. In this our positions coincided. On the Sunday before November 9th there was a big parade in Munich. The entire Bavarian government was there. The Reichswehr, the police and patriotic associations, and we were marching too. Suddenly we discovered that it was not von Kahr, but the Bavarian Crown Prince Ruprecht who was standing on the platform. This was extremely disconcerting for us. We had a suspicion that Bavaria, by wanting to follow the path of secession, might break away from the Reich. Nothing could be further from our plans. We wanted a strong Reich, a united Reich, and we wanted to see it free of certain parties as well as of the current leaders. We had given up on the so-called March on Berlin. When this became clear and Herr von Kahr called the famous meeting at the Bürgerbraukeller, the time had come to thwart these plans and take concrete steps towards the plan for a greater Germany. Thus the events of November 9th, 1923, came about very quickly. Personally, I was prepared, and never made any secret of it, to take part in any revolution against the so-called November Republic, no matter what occasion arose or who initiated it, with the exception of left-wing actions, and I was always ready to lend my services for these tasks.
When, after these events, did you meet Hitler again?
First, I was in an Austrian hospital, and here the Bavarian People's Court was hearing a case concerning 9 November.
Who was charged?
Hitler was the main defendant, and of course all the others who participated and were present at these events. I was in a serious condition in Upper Bavaria for several days, then taken to the border, arrested, and then transferred to another place by the Bavarian police. At that time I asked Hitler whether I should appear before the court. He assured me that I would not, and so I did. Therefore the trial could not take place in private, because I would have declared that if I did, I would be able to make public statements about the trial. After I recovered, I spent a year in Italy and then in another country. In 1926 or 1927 there was a general amnesty for all those who had been prosecuted for illegal crimes. One might say, action, it applied not only to us but also to leftists and peasants, and I was able to return to Germany. I met Hitler again in 1927 at a rather short meeting in Berlin in which he participated. At that time I was not involved in party work, but rather tried to remain more independent. I had no contact with Hitler then either. Shortly before the Reichstag elections on 26 May 1928, Hitler called me and told me that he wanted me to be the first number on the list of candidates for the Reichstag for the National Socialist Party. He asked me if I agreed, and my answer was yes. This meant that my involvement in party work would increase.
One question. Were you involved in SA at that time?
No, I was not involved in South African affairs at that time. There were new appointments, and the new SA chief, von Pfeffer, naturally clung to his position and was not interested in seeing me involved with the SA.
So after 1923, you had no place or position in the SA?
After 1923, my active work in the SA ceased. Only after the seizure of power, later when so-called honorary offices were created, did I receive an honorary office, the highest rank in the SA. But in 1928 I was elected to the Reichstag, and from then on I began to travel around the country as a party representative. The SA, I don't remember in which year, was reformed and was no longer limited to Bavaria, but extended to the entire Reich.
Were they banned after 1923?
After 1923 they were banned for a time.
When was that ban lifted?
I cannot say exactly when, but in any case it was before I returned to Germany. In any case, they spread throughout Germany, and this was extremely necessary. The parties of that time, the larger ones, all had so-called combat units. The most active was, as far as I remember, the Red Front, an association of combat units of the Communists, our greatest adversaries, with whom we had constant skirmishes and who often tried to disrupt our meetings. There was also the Reich Banner, an organization of the Social Democrats, the Democratic Party. There was also the Steel Helmet, a right-wing nationalist organization. And finally there was our SA, which was an organization of the same kind. I must point out that the SA suffered great losses at that time. Most of the SA members came from the broad masses of the people, the smallest employees, workers, people who participated in the ideology. They were often badly wounded. Many were shot dead during clashes. They were persecuted by the government. They could not be civil servants. Civil servants could not join the SA. They were under extreme pressure. I would like to pay great respect and honour to these people, the members of the SA, who were not, as is now presented, only bearers of cruelty, but were rather men who voluntarily subjected themselves to the most difficult tests and restrictions because of their idealism and their goals, and gave up many things for the sake of their ideals.
What place did he occupy in the party from 1928 until the seizure of power?
I held no position in the party. I was never a political leader of the party, which seems strange in the party leadership or anywhere else. First of all, as I have already said, I was a member of the Reichstag, and consequently a member of the party faction in the Reichstag. At the same time, I was a representative of the party, travelling from town to town, trying to do everything possible to expand the party, to strengthen it, to attract and persuade new members, and especially to attract communist and Marxist supporters to our side, to create a broad base in the people based not only on right-wing circles, which were nationalist. Since the middle of 1932, after having participated in countless elections, making speeches, for example, 3 times an afternoon and often all night long, I, as a member of the party, or rather because the party had a strong representation in the Reichstag, was elected president of the Reichstag and consequently had to take on political tasks. Shortly before that, at the end of 1931, when I saw that the party was growing, the Führer told me that he would like to have a personal representative, independent of the party, who would take over the leadership of the party. He could carry out political negotiations. This person was not to be bound by party obligations. He asked me to take on these tasks, since I lived in the capital of the Reich. I accepted this assignment, which was not a post, but rather a mission. In a few sentences, he explained to me that I was free to negotiate with all parties, from the communists to the extreme right, to counteract certain actions in the Reichstag and to implement appropriate political measures. Naturally. At the same time as this task, I had to devote myself to the dissemination and introduction of our ideas in these circles. These circles, as has been pointed out, belong to industrial and intellectual groups. Since I had connections and access to these circles, it was natural that the Führer considered me particularly suitable for such a task, since he could absolutely count on me in this respect, and knew that I would devote all my energies to promoting our ideas. When I became president of the Reichstag, my task became easier. I was now able to act in the legal field and was even obliged to take part in political events. If, for example, a government resigned before the Reichstag or resigned in the event of a vote of no confidence, my main duty as president of the Reichstag was to propose to the Reich President, after negotiations with the parties, options for a new coalition government. Thus, the Reich President always had to receive me for these matters. Of course, in this way, I created rather a personal bond between him and me, but I want to emphasize that such a bond already existed before. The reason for this was, of course, that Field Marshal von Hindenburg had known me since the World War, and if I asked him, he would always receive me.
What role did he play in Hitler's appointment as Reich Chancellor?
First of all, I want to explain that when I said that I had no position in the party, no political position, at the same time my role naturally became stronger and stronger, especially from the end of 1931, when I began to work more and more closely with the Führer, and of course I was considered his closest collaborator, but only on the basis of the usual and natural growth of powers that increased after the seizure of power. Regarding my involvement in Hitler's appointment, in giving my explanations to the court, I would first like to briefly describe the situation at that time. The balance between the parliamentary parties had already been broken at the end of 1931 or beginning of 1932. Things were going badly in Germany, and it was impossible to form a parliamentary majority, while at the same time the decree on emergency measures came into force, which partly excluded the operation of the Constitution. I remember the Brüning government, which was working on plans to extend the decree on emergency powers, and at the same time was concerned about the requirements of Article 48 of the Constitution. Then came the von Papen government, which nor did it succeed in creating a parliamentary basis on a more stable platform. Von Papen tried to make this a reality, and in order to create a parliamentary platform he turned to the National Socialists, the strongest party at that time, in order to form a basis with other parties. There were talks. Von Papen's name was being considered as a candidate for Reich Chancellor, while Hitler was to be appointed Vice-Chancellor. I remember that I told von Papen that Hitler could be any number but not number 2. If he was to deal with any matter, he would naturally have to play the leading role, so it would be unacceptable and unthinkable for the Führer to play a secondary role. We would then have to create a government without realizing all our ideas, and Hitler, as the representative of the strongest party, would be responsible for such things. We categorically rejected this. I do not want to develop this subject, as Herr von Papen, my brother now in disgrace. You know that we have always respected you personally, but I told you then that after such a gesture, not only would we not support you, but we would oppose your government in the Reichstag, simply because we would fight against any government that did not consider us as a majority. Then it was, I cannot remember how many months later, that I found Papen in office. There was a well-known conflict between him and me, he as Reich Chancellor and I as President of the Reichstag, in which my determination to bring his government to a standstill. I knew that the Communists had planned a vote of no confidence, which the rest of us could support. A vote of no confidence was necessary to demonstrate to the Reich President that under any circumstances no government can be maintained without sufficient reserves. I had seen the red briefcase and knew that the order for dissolution was ready, but first I wanted to take a vote. 32 votes were for von Papen and almost 500 against. The von Papen government was resigned. Until then, all parties had participated in the formation of governments, except for very small parties, all those who could have done so in public. Toward the end, Reich Defense Minister von Schleicher, the Grey Cardinal, began to play an increasingly important role. As a result, there were now only 2 possibilities. Either the appropriate share of power was given to the leader of the strongest party, as is usually the case and is usually done at meetings and certified by credentials, or the man acted behind the scenes.
You have given explanations about your involvement in the appointment of Hitler as Reich Chancellor. Will you continue?
I have reached a decisive period. The negotiations have become in part more difficult. Field Marshal Reich President von Hindenburg, who had only known the Führer personally through a few sentences, and who had not yet overcome his distrust of him, a distrust that had been maintained and filled for many years through various influences, simply because he did not know him, then demanded certain rigid restrictions so that we, the strongest and leading party, which was willing to assume responsibility for the nation, were under relative restrictions. In comparison with our strength, we were significantly underrepresented in the government. We must not forget that Germany was at the lowest point of its condition. There were 8 million unemployed. Every program was failing. There was no party consensus. There was a very strong left-wing party and political disadvantage. Therefore, it was necessary the measures that people expected us to take if we were to lead the government. so it was a heavy burden to take on such a responsibility in such a harsh political environment. The first condition: the Reich President wanted Herr von Papen to become Vice-Chancellor of the government under any circumstances. Except for sympathy for von Papen's personality, he could give us nothing more because there was no party behind him. But the Reich President nevertheless demanded that Herr von Papen submit to him the reports that the Führer, as Reich Chancellor, had prepared. This was quickly forgotten, even by the Reich President himself. Secondly, the Reich President wanted the Foreign Office to be independent of the parties and to be in the hands of Herr von Neurath. Herr von Neurath, moreover, could not give us any political resources other than his knowledge and ability. Thirdly, the post of Prime Minister of Prussia, second only to that of Reich Chancellor, which was the most important post in Germany after the World War, was to be given to von Papen's man. Before the World War, as is well known, the posts of Reich Chancellor and Prime Minister of Prussia were unified. Fourthly, the Reich President demanded that the post of Minister of Defense should be held by an independent man, a military man, appointed by him personally, and this was to be General von Blomberg, who was at that time at the disarmament conference in Geneva. Neither I nor the Führer knew Mr. von Blomberg personally.
In your opinion, did the party come to power legally?
Of course, the party came to power in a perfectly legal way, because the party was called by the Reich President in accordance with the Constitution, and given the strength of the party, this should have happened much earlier. The party gained strength and came to power through regular elections and in accordance with the law.
What steps did he take to consolidate his power after Hitler's appointment?
It must be said that since we had to come to power, we had to be determined to retain it under any circumstances. We did not want power and governmental powers just for their own sake, but in order to make Germany free and strong. We could not leave room for chance, for elections, for parliamentary majorities, but we wanted to carry out the task to which we had committed ourselves.
What positions have you held since coming to power?
At first, as before, I was President of the Reichstag, and I held that office until the end. In the government, I was first given the office of Minister and Reichskommissar of Aviation, but not of the Air Force. For the sake of clarity, I would like to say that I soon realized the need to develop the Air Force. In Prussia, I was appointed Minister of the Interior, and on 20 April 1933, also Prime Minister of Prussia. The Reichskommissariat was first converted into the Ministry of Aviation, I'm sure, in March 1933. Then there were some less important posts, such as President of the State Council and others. However, at that time, the two posts of Prussian Prime Minister on the one hand and Minister of Aviation on the other were important. At the beginning of 1934, I handed over the Prussian Ministry of the Interior to the Reich Minister of the Interior because it was part of the consolidation of power, above all to clarify the need for good administration by the Reich, for which the Prussian ministries had to be merged with those of the Reich. Only in this way could the Reich ministries receive information about the daily political work and also the work of the divisions. Only with this unification was this possible.
Did your mandate as Prussian Minister of the Interior include the creation of the Gestapo and the concentration camps so often mentioned here? When and for what purposes were they established?
I have already pointed out before that in order to strengthen power, the first necessity was to create new forms of controlling the instrument, which at all times and in all nations is the internal political instrument of power, that is, the police. There was no Reich police, only provincial police forces. The most important was the Prussian police. It had already been formed by our predecessors, the old parties who had arranged their men according to their preferences. I have mentioned those who occupied the posts of police commissioners and those who were heads of the main units of the Prussian Ministry of the Interior. Thus our opponents, our bitterest opponents, who often used police measures against us, remained in the regional offices. Previously, before I came to power, there had been a slight reduction when the Social Democratic government of Braun-Severing was replaced by that of Mr. von Papen. After this, our bitterest opponents were removed from the police. Since the most important posts were still in the hands of certain political opponents, I could not expect those who until yesterday had used the police as a brutal means of combating us to show loyalty to the new state. Before Prussia came to power, it already had a political police. This was the police department, whose task was to watch over and fight the National Socialists, and partly the communists. All I had to do was appoint new people to this political police and allow them to continue their work. But the situation changed when we came to power. As I said before, the Communist Party was extremely strong. It had about 6 million voters and a Red Front organization that could be used as an instrument of the revolution. It was very clear to the Communist Party that the longer we were in power, the weaker its position would be. In retrospect, the threat of political unrest and an atmosphere of conflict definitely existed at that time, which could have provoked communist-inspired revolutionary acts. Even after our seizure of power, political assassinations took place and attempts by the National Socialists and police did not cease, but rather intensified. In view of the information I received, I had to take decisive measures in this direction. Therefore, in the form in which this office existed, it could not prevent this danger. It needed a responsible political police, not only in the central apparatus, but also in its subdivisions. Therefore, it was necessary to strengthen this instrument. In order to make it clear that the purpose of this police force was to provide security for the state, I called it the State Security Police. Under that name, I established a network of police stations. I recruited political officials in large numbers who had experience, and at first also some people from party circles, because I valued having a professional aptitude. I also wanted this police force to be concerned primarily with the defense of the state against enemies. The leader I selected for this task was a former police officer, but not a party man. He, Diels, had already served there as Oberregierungsrat, and later as Ministerial Rat, like most other Gestapo leaders, being an officer and not a party man. Later, more and more party elements appeared in the police. Their task was above all to take all possible precautions against left-wing action as quickly as possible. I knew, as was later confirmed, that the communist headquarters in Berlin, the Liebknecht House, was well fortified and contained many weapons. We also had information about serious links between the Russian trade mission and the German Communist Party. Even if I arrested, as I did, thousands of communist officials at the stroke of a pen, the constant threat remained. The danger of the spread of ideas remained. It was necessary to uncover the system of secret connections and keep it under constant surveillance. This was an important task for the police authorities. The Social Democratic Party, in my opinion, was not so dangerous, especially considering the people who belonged to it. However, they remained absolute opponents of our new state. Some of its officials were radical, others less radical. I preferred to keep most of the radicals under surveillance, while a large number of former Social Democratic ministers, Prussian provincial leaders and high officials were quietly retired and granted their pensions, without any action being taken against them. Of course, there were other Social Democratic Party officials whom we kept a close eye on. For these purposes, I initially established a secret state police in Prussia, as I had no authority in other states at that time. The subsequent organization of the rest of the police is not so important here.
Concentration camps?
When necessity demanded, first of all, the creation of order and the elimination of the most dangerous elements of disorder directed against us, I immediately decided to arrest the communist officials and leaders. I had a list for this purpose, and it was clear to me that, having arrested the most dangerous and important officials, there were still several thousand others involved in these activities. So it was necessary to arrest not only party officials, but also those who were members of the Red Front, an organization linked to the party. These arrests were dictated by state security and necessity. The question was how to eliminate the danger. There was only one possibility: preventive detention. In order to prevent and possibly eliminate the danger, there was preventive detention for those who were confirmed to be involved in activities that were treasonable or hostile to the state, or who could be expected to carry out such activities. This was not something new, nor had it been invented by the National Socialists. Previously, this type of preventive detention had been used against communists, but above all against us, the National Socialists. Prisons were not suitable for such a task, and I also wanted to emphasize from the outset that this was a way of protecting the state. I therefore ordered that these people be interned in camps. 1 or 2 camps were then proposed, because I could not say how long the detention of these people would be necessary, nor how many would arrive in view of the communist revelation of the movement. When we occupied Karl Liebknecht's house, We found there so many weapons, materials, and preparations for civil war that few could say how big the movement was. I have already pointed out as an obvious fact that from the position of the great confrontation existing between the extreme wings of these political adversaries, in the light of the bitterness of the opposition caused by the continuous skirmishes in the street, the mutual confrontation, etc., caused by the political struggle, the situation was not always convenient for the prisoners. For this reason, I ordered that the police be used as far as possible to guard the camps. Only in cases of insufficiency was it necessary to resort to outside forces. I have expressed my opinion on the question of concentration camps, and I must point out that the name was not invented by us, but first appeared in the foreign press and then came into common use. When this name first appeared is rather a question of historical character. At the end of 1933, in a book which appeared in England at the request of an English publisher, and which the prosecution had already introduced into evidence, I expressed my opinion on the subject very openly. That was at the end of 1933. I point out again that the book was intended for foreign countries, for English-speaking countries. Of course there were excesses at the beginning. Of course here and there innocent people suffered. Of course here and there were beatings, acts of brutality. But compared with all that had happened in the past, with the grandeur of the events, the German Revolution was bloodless and the most disciplined of all the revolutions in history.
Did you supervise the custody of prisoners?
Naturally, I gave instructions that such things should not happen. They did happen, and they did happen everywhere to a greater or lesser extent, as I have already said. I always pointed out that such things should not happen, because the important thing for me was always to get these people on our side, to re-educate them.
What did you do with the cases of abuse that you became aware of?
I became personally interested in concentration camps in the spring of 1934. At that time there were 2 or 3 camps in Prussia.
After consolidating power, did he ever release large numbers of prisoners, and when was that?
At Christmas 1933 I gave the order to release the accused in minor cases, that is, less dangerous cases, and in those cases where it was obvious that people had already stopped resisting. There were about 5,000 of them. I repeated this again in November 1934 for 2,000 prisoners. I point out again that this applied only to Prussia. At that time, as far as I remember, I cannot say exactly, but one camp was dissolved, or at least temporarily closed, and this happened at a time when no one anticipated that it would be the subject of an investigation by an international court.
For how long were you in charge of the Gestapo and the concentration camps? Until what date?
I was actually in charge until the beginning of 1934, that is, in the beginning of 1934, Dilts was in charge, and he gave me frequent reports on the work of the Gestapo and the concentration camps. Meanwhile, outside Prussia, the police were being reformed, with responsibility for the police in all German states, except Prussia being transferred to Himmler. Probably having appreciated my measures, he began to set up a state secret police there as well, since the police at that time was still a matter of state regulation. There were police forces in Bavaria, Württemberg, Baden, Hesse, Saxony, etc. He was to be the head of all these police forces, and of course he was now also trying to get the leadership of the Prussian police. I was satisfied with Diehl's work, and from my point of view, I saw no need to change anything. These activities, I am sure, began as early as the end of 1933. Shortly afterwards, I transferred the Prussian Ministry of the Interior to the Reich Ministry of the Interior, and in the spring of 1934 I was no longer minister of that department. Himmler, I am convinced, probably strongly demanded that the Führer transfer responsibility for the Prussian police to him. At the time I did not directly object to this. I found it unpleasant. I myself wanted to be in charge of my police. However, when the Führer asked me to do so, saying that it was right and proper, and that it was necessary to fight the enemies of the state with unified methods, I handed the police over to Himmler, who put Heydrich in charge. But formally I continued to control it because there was no Reich police. The rest of the police, i.e. the state police and the paramilitary police, I did not hand over to him. As I will explain later, in Prussia I had a well-organized police force with a military structure, which was in a state of readiness to participate in the rearmament program. For this reason I could not and did not want to hand over the paramilitary police, since it was being prepared exclusively for military purposes. It was created by me on my own initiative and under my responsibility, and had nothing to do with a real police force. Later, in 1935, I incorporated it into the armed forces. In 1936, the Reich Police Law was passed, and the position of Chief of the German Police was created. Under this law, the police were legally and formally subordinated to the Reichsführer SS, also known as the Chief of the German Police.
You mentioned the Röhm Putsch earlier. Who was Röhm, and why is an event like the Putsch associated with him?
Röhm was head of the SA, Chief of the SA General Staff.
I think it is best to adjourn the meeting. It is 5 o'clock.
Thursday, March 14th, 1946, morning session.
Did you participate in the elaboration of the party program?
The party program was developed and proclaimed when I first heard of the movement and expressed my desire to join it.
What was your attitude to the provisions of the party program?
Generally positive. It goes without saying that hardly any politically thinking person recognizes and agrees with all the provisions of a political party's program.
Apart from the known provisions of the party program, were there any objectives that remained secret?
No.
Was it considered possible to achieve these objectives by any means, including illegal methods?
Of course, they could have been achieved by any means. Perhaps the notion of illegal should be clarified. If I set the goal of revolution, then it is illegal for the existing order. If I succeeded, then the revolution becomes a fact and consequently legal and legitimate. Before 1923 and the events of November 9th, I and all of us had the perspective that we would try to achieve our goal, if necessary, by revolutionary means. After this attempt failed, the Führer, after the liberation of the fortress, decided that in the future we would use the methods of political struggle like the other parties, and the Führer prohibited any illegal actions in order to avoid the ban on party activities.
When and for what purpose were the SS created?
The SS was created when I was abroad, I think, in 1926 or 1927. Its purpose, as far as I remember, was to create, first of all, within the movement, a specially selected unit to keep watch over the Führer. At first, there were very few of them.
Have you ever been in the SS?
I never belonged to the SS in any way, neither directly nor indirectly.
So the statement that you were an SS general is incorrect?
Completely wrong.
How did you understand the term master race?
As far as I am concerned, I have not understood anything about it. Neither in any of my speeches nor in my writings does this term appear. In my opinion, if one is a gentleman, one need not pay attention to it.
How did you understand the theory of living space?
This is a rather controversial theory. I can understand that term in connection with the United Powers, which together, I mean the four decisive powers, declared 3/4 of the world theirs, and came up with their own explanation for it. But for us, where there were 144 people per square kilometre, the words living space meant the necessary proportion between the population and its well-being and standard of living.
The expression that is always mentioned is power grab.
I would call the seizure of power a technical term. Another term could be used, but it reflects quite clearly the fact that we have, so to speak, seized power.
What is your attitude towards the Führer principle?
I supported this principle, and now I evaluate it favourably and consciously. We must not make the mistake of forgetting that the political systems of different countries have different origins, different developments. What is perfectly suitable for one country is not suitable for another. Germany, during centuries of monarchy, had the Führer principle. Democracy came to Germany when things were going badly, and we hit rock bottom. I explained it yesterday. The general lack of unity in Germany, the multiplicity of parties, the constant anxiety caused by elections. There was a complete distortion of the theories of power and responsibility in the opposite direction. Instead of the other way around, power lay with the masses and responsibility with the leader. In my opinion, Germany, especially at the time of the lowest fall, should have followed the right path with all its might to the Führer principle. That is, power from the top down and responsibility from the bottom up, which was the only possible one. Naturally, I was aware that a principle that sounded like this could involve extremes. I must point out some parallels. The place of the Catholic Church rests, as before, on a pure hierarchical leadership. I think it can be said of Russia that without the Führer principle, it would not have been able to withstand the hard tests of the last war.
Considering the measures to strengthen your power that you described yesterday, were they carried out with the authorization of Reich President von Hindenburg?
As long as the Reich president was alive and therefore working, the measures were naturally carried out in agreement with him. Since his approval was a constitutional necessity, according to paragraph 48, this approval was given.
Was the National Socialist government recognized by foreign powers?
Our government was recognized from the first day of its existence and remained so until the end, with the exception of a few states with which diplomatic relations were broken.
Did diplomatic representatives from foreign countries attend the party congresses in Nuremberg?
Diplomatic representatives were invited to the party congresses, these great events and great demonstrations of the strength of the movement, and they were present, perhaps not every year. But I remember one very well.
Until what year?
Until the last party congress in 1938.
To what extent were there confiscations of assets of political opponents after coming to power?
Laws were passed to confiscate the property of persons hostile to the state, as well as the property of parties hostile to the state. The property of the Communist Party and its branches, and that of the Social Democratic Party, was partially confiscated. But I would like to point out that the personal property of party members, or even of its leaders, was not confiscated. The contrast was that many of the leading Social Democrats who were ministers or civil servants continued to draw their pensions. They were even increased in the future.
How do you explain the actions against unions and independent workers' organizations?
First of all, the trade unions. In Germany, most of the trade unions, or at least the most important ones, were closely connected with the Social Democratic Party and also under the influence of the Communists, the Communist Party. They were the real, if not formal, very active organs of these parties, and in this case I'm not talking about the bulk of their members, but about the leaders of these unions. In addition, there was a small Christian trade union, an organ of the Centre Party. These unions, because their leaders maintained close contacts with the parties we considered our adversaries, agreed with our adversaries that they would not participate in the organization of the new state. The trade union organizations were soon dissolved, and the German Labour Front was organized for the workers. In my opinion, this did not lead to the destruction of the freedom of the German workers. On the contrary, I am convinced that we were the only ones who gave real freedom to the German workers, above all in the exercise of the right to work, thus elevating their position in the state. We certainly did away with two things which are probably characteristic of a free society and which I cannot understand: strikes on the one hand and lockouts on the other. These things could not be reconciled either with the right to work or with the duty of every citizen to pursue the goal of national greatness. We were able to replace these two essential elements, which also contributed to unemployment, with our colossal work program. The creation of employment, which was the other essential provision of our social program, was also used by the others, only under another name. I do not want to dwell on this social program. However, it was the first time that a worker was entitled to holidays, paid holidays. That is only one part of it. A major welfare system was established for the workers. Huge sums were invested in building housing for the workers. Until then, they had been used and exploited. They had hardly any property because of the times of unemployment. Without going into details, I would sum it up by saying that we did not enslave the workers, but rather freed them from the misery of unemployment.
Yesterday you spoke about the Röhm Rebellion. Who was Röhm and what kind of rebellion was it?
Röhm, since 1931, was Chief of Staff of the SA, that is, he was responsible for the SA to the Führer, who in turn was the Supreme Commander of the SA, and directed in the name of the Führer.
Monday, March 18th, 1946. Morning session.
Witness, is it true, as the prosecution claims, that you were a Reichsführer of the SA?
I was not a Reichsführer of the SA. Such a title did not exist. In 1923, on the 9th of November, I was the commander of the SA, which then existed in Bavaria and, to a lesser extent, in Württemberg.
According to this, how long have you been an SA commander?
I just said until November 1923.
What was your influence before and after 1923 in relation to the leadership of the SA, bringing people in, giving orders?
Please repeat the question.
What was your influence before and after 1923 in relation to the leadership of the SA, propaganda among SA members, and the transmission of orders?
From the beginning of 1923 until 9 November 1923, my influence was absolute and complete. That is, I was directly in command of the SA. After 1923, I had no further connection with the SA.
What was it like before 1923? Was the relationship before 1923 the same as after 1923?
What do you mean?
Was your attitude towards the SA before 1923 the same afterwards?
I have explained this very clearly. Until November 1923, I was a commander in the SA with full authority and the right to give orders. After 1923, there was nothing that bound me to the SA as far as orders were concerned. I only held, I don't know from what year, probably from 1936 or something like that, an honourable position in the SA, but without any specific authority. Apart from that, there was nothing that bound me.
In the course of your testimony last week concerning the SA people, you said that they were prepared to make great sacrifices. Now I would like to ask you what kind of sacrifices they made.
The sacrifices of the SA men were as follows. They gave all their free time to the movement without pay. They lived without family and without rest, so that in difficult moments of struggle they could always be at the disposal of the party, during election campaigns, long parades, defence meetings, etc. In my eyes, these are considerable sacrifices. The majority of SA members can be regarded as workers and small employees who needed time to rest, but who were always ready to give themselves completely to the party and to work for its political ideals in accordance with their political opinions.
Were these people promised material benefits?
Not at all.
Is it true that especially after the seizure of power, many communist agitators joined the SA?
Please repeat the question.
Is it true that especially after coming to power, a large number of communists were able to join the SA?
This was a very important and vital question. Since action was taken against the Communist Party after coming to power, which was only logically to be expected, many members of the Red Front, the fighting organization, joined the SA, especially in the big cities, where it was easier. This was easier because the head of the SA room did not divide the members of the SA into those who were party members and those who were not. Consequently, anyone could become a member of the SA without joining the party.
Mr. President, I must ask your permission to ask one more basic question concerning the honourable leadership. There were honorary posts in the SA, for example, Obergruppenführer, Gruppenführer, Brigadeführer, Standartenführer, and Sturmführer. Witness, I must ask you, could you explain the importance of the post of honorary leader in the SA as regards training in the SA and giving orders? What kind of influence did they have?
Honorary S. A leaders were appointed for all occasions and for all reasons. They had purely representative functions, i.e., they participated in ceremonies in the manner of the SA. They were not active members of the SA and were not informed of the internal activities of the SA, its operations, or other tasks. Their function was decorative.
Witness, could you say whether the Gestapo in 1933, when it was created by you, was a National Socialist combat unit, or was it rather a state institution such as, for example, the criminal police or another institution of the Reich?
I have already pointed out that it was a purely state institution, built on the basis of the existing police force, which was simply reorganized according to the new state principles. At that time, it had no connection with the party. The party had no power or influence to give orders or directives of any kind. It was a purely state institution whose members and employees were civil servants with all rights and duties.
As far as you know, were there any changes after the state police came under Himmler's control and up to 1945?
Up to 1934, it was exactly as I have described. Then, in the course of further consolidation, the SS element became stronger, and probably many people from there joined. But even these, at that time everyone had to be vetted, became and remained civil servants. I heard nothing about changes in state status, but gradually over the years all civil servants, whether they wanted it or not, I think, were given SS ranks. So Gestapo officials who probably before 1939 or 1940 had nothing to do with the SS, and who came there in the old days, that is, who were police officials of the Weimar Republic, were automatically given SS ranks. They remained civil servants. The Gestapo was an apparatus made up of German police officials.
Is it true that after Himmler came to power as police commissioner of Munich, he was in charge of the political and criminal police of Bavaria?
As far as I know, and I have already explained this, Himmler was the first police commissioner in Munich, Very quickly, probably within a week or two, he appointed himself commander of the Bavarian police. Then, within a month or two, this happened very quickly, he became, I don't remember what the exact name of the position was, the supreme police chief of all the free German provinces and cities, with the exception of Prussia.
You said earlier that Gestapo officers were accepted into the SS. Was this voluntary, or was there a desire on the part of some of the authoritative leaders to have these officers join the SS?
I think I heard from a staff member I met before that they did. They were not accepted into the SS, but they were given the rank of SS. It was probably Himmler's idea that the SS and the police should be under his direction and united. I cannot say how he explained it and how it was put into practice in detail. Consequently, I can probably state here things of which I know little.
You said earlier that in 1933, political police officers who had previously worked in the political police were recruited into the state police. Was this voluntarily, or were they ordered to transfer without their consent?
You are wrong when you say that the members of the former political police were simply incorporated into the Gestapo, because it was a political police force and contained representatives of those parties that were hostile and opposed to us. They should have been dismissed. Little by little, new cadres were brought in, especially as their numbers increased. This new personnel was recruited from other units, from the criminal police, or from somewhere else. And as I have already said, personnel were recruited from outside, especially, of course, our people were taken into account. Herr Müller was transferred from the criminal police to the secret state police, and I do not know whether he was asked about this. I am sure that he was not. I had by then already resigned as head of the secret state police. After I had given the basic directives, I was not concerned with the problems of individual officials of the criminal police.
Did you know Obergruppenführer Müller, head of Section 4 of the Reich Security Directorate?
I knew him.
Are you aware that he and his staff served in the Bavarian political police, which existed until 1933?
I didn't know. I just knew he was from Bavaria.
Do you know that the secret state police did not participate in the riots of 9 November 1938?
I have always believed that they were not involved in them. I have seen the document in which they were ordered not to interfere. I am not sure that they were involved.
Were you aware that such acts were regularly committed in the Gestapo, or that such acts were committed contrary to such orders? Or if such acts did take place, were they isolated cases or individual excesses?
At the time when I was directly connected with the Gestapo, such excesses occurred, as I have already said. I ordered that they be punished, those who were discovered. Punishments were imposed. The officers knew that if they did such things, they would be punished.
I have no further questions. Witness, did the conditions for occupying an honourable position in the SA correspond to honourable positions in the SS?
Yes, I think so.
Are you familiar with the directives or other regulations regarding the appointment of honourable leaders?
No.
Was it possible to refuse the appointment?
I think so.
Do you know the reasons for the growth of the Waffen-SS into a large organisation after 1939?
The first Waffen-SS divisions, made up of carefully selected manpower, fought with astonishing bravery. The Führer subsequently readily agreed to Himmler's proposal to increase the number of divisions. The Army and Air Force protested somewhat, and rightly so, because this selected volunteer material meant that men of the type who could make excellent officers for both the Army and the Air Force were being lost, and so they opposed this expansion. Furthermore, at first the Führer was not interested in having large armed formations outside the army, but he increasingly allowed this. When the problems of resupply became more and more acute as the war continued, Himmler more or less deceived the Führer by claiming that he could create many SS divisions, which would attract many recruits and so on. This was, of course, good news for the Führer, as he needed new troops. But at the same time, Himmler used methods of creating divisions that were very different from voluntary ones, and began to create many SS divisions on paper. He did not have enough men to do this at the time, so he told the Führer, "I must transfer my best Unterführers from other units to new SS divisions." For this and other reasons, replenishment was not to go to the Army or the Air Force, especially not to the Air Force, which was already bearing the brunt of the war. Now I had to transfer men from the ground staff and anti-aircraft batteries to these divisions. All this created frustration among the Air Force personnel, because none of them wanted to volunteer for these divisions. But in the end, The Führer ordered that these men be drawn from the Army Reserve units and, as far as I remember, from the Sailors' Reserves. I can only speak of the contingent that was drawn from the Air Force under my command. I estimate, without referring to official reports, that it was at least 50,000 men and officers. Then, as very strong feelings were beginning to arise, I ordered that the Air Force personnel, who were being used in ground combat, should not be transferred to the SS, but that new airborne units should be transferred. The Führer agreed, because in the last stage of the war, the airborne divisions confirmed the hopes placed on them and were the most excellent of all the armed forces, surpassing the SS in morale and strength of resistance. After that, no airborne contingents were transferred to the SS, and, as far as I know, no more SS divisions were formed.
I have no more questions.
The interrogation of Hermann Göring by the prosecution, Monday, March 18, 1946. Morning session.
If you were to answer 3 or 4 questions yes or no, that would give you the opportunity to express the full version of that oath. First of all, did you want a strong German state to overcome the conditions of Versailles?
We wanted a strong German state, independent of Versailles, but in order to leave Versailles, the state had to first be strong. For a weak state, this was impossible. We knew that from experience.
And you introduced the Führer principle for building a strong state?
Correct.
And this goal, which was one of the goals of the Nazi Party to change the terms of Versailles, was a public, high-profile goal designed to attract people to the party, was it not?
The dictates of Versailles were such that every German, in my opinion, was aware that simply changing them would not change anything. It was clear that this was a compelling reason to join the party.
So those people involved in the movement are not here, and for the record, you have no doubt that Adolf Hitler is dead?
I think there is no doubt.
And the same goes for Goebbels?
Goebbels, I have no doubt about it, because I have heard people I fully trust say that they saw him dead.
And you don't doubt Himmler's death, do you?
I have not made a decision on this, but I think you have, since you know more than I do, as he died while I was your prisoner. I was not there.
You have no doubt about Heydrich's death, do you?
I'm absolutely sure of it.
And probably with Bormann.
I'm not absolutely sure about that. I have no confirmation. I don't know, but I assume so.
And about the main personalities you mention in your testimony, who was responsible? Hitler for everything, Goebbels for inciting riots against the Jews, Himmler, who deceived Hitler, Bormann, who deceived him about his will.
The influence exerted on the Führer changed over time. The main influence on the Führer, at least until late 1941 or early 1942, if we are talking about influence, was my own. Then, from 1943 onwards, my influence gradually diminished, after which it declined rapidly. In general, I am not sure that anyone had the same influence on the Führer as I did. After me, or independently of me in terms of influence, Goebbels, with whom the Führer spent a lot of time, was influential in certain areas from the beginning. This influence varied over time, being weak, then becoming much stronger in the last years of the war, as this influence could easily be changed by the media. Before and immediately after the seizure of power, Hess had a certain influence, but only in his own special sphere. Then, over the years, Himmler's influence grew. From the end of 1944, his influence rapidly declined. The most decisive influence on the Führer in the course of the war, and especially from 1942 onwards, after Hess's flight in 1941 and after a year, was exercised by Herr Bormann. Later, he had a devastatingly strong influence in the end. This was possible because after July 20th, the Führer was full of mistrust, and because Bormann was constantly with him and informed him of what was happening. Generally speaking, these people had more or less influence at different times.
In 1933, you were in charge of a special intelligence organization that monitored the telephone conversations of public officials and other people inside and outside Germany, weren't you?
I have already explained that he had a technical apparatus, as you have said, which monitored the conversations of important foreigners with and abroad. Telegrams and wireless messages were intercepted, which were transmitted not only from Germany to abroad, but also from abroad. He also monitored the telephone conversations in Germany of all important foreigners, important companies, sometimes people who, for some political or police reason, had to be monitored. To prevent police abuse, this department was only allowed to monitor telephone conversations with my permission. Nevertheless, uncontrolled wiretapping was possible, as is still possible everywhere.
You kept the results of those reports to yourself, didn't you?
No, there was an order. Reports that were of interest to the Foreign Office were forwarded to it. Reports that were important for the Führer went to the Führer. Reports that were important for the military authorities went to the Minister of War, the Minister of Aviation, or the Minister of Economics. I or my deputy decided for which department the reports were important. There was a person whose duty it was to review these secret reports and pass them on only to me. I could, of course, order that this or that report should come to my attention only and not be passed on. That was always possible.
You had difficulties with other law enforcement authorities who wanted to take control of this organization, right?
Yes, indeed. The police were eager to get hold of this instrument, but they got nothing from me and probably had to keep an eye out here and there. But the decisive control remained in the hands of the post office, which was technically subordinate only to me.
You have heard the prosecution's evidence against all of the defendants, haven't you?
Yes.
Could you name those actions of your co-defendants that were not necessary to carry out the plans of the Nazi Party?
So far, the accusation is based on assumptions only. They are not supported by facts. These assumptions contain many actions that were not necessary.
Could you point out those actions and those accused that, in your opinion, were outside the party's plans?
It is a very difficult question that I cannot answer right now without the data.
I object to this question. I am not sure that it is a question of fact, but rather an assertion, and it is impossible to give an answer to such a general question.
Mr. Jackson, the court believes that the question is formulated too broadly. You said that the Nazi Party's program was designed to correct certain injustices that you saw in the Treaty of Versailles, and I ask you, did the party's program address issues unrelated to the treaty at all?
Of course, the program contained many other provisions, which did not refer to the Treaty of Versailles.
I would like to draw your attention to the following statement from Mein Kampf. The 1914 frontiers mean nothing to the German nation. They have represented no defense in the past, and they represent no strength in the future. They will give the German people neither internal security nor satisfaction, nor are they militarily favorable or satisfactory. Is all this true or not?
I must reread the authentic text in Mein Kampf to determine exactly what you have read. I assume that it is correct. If so, I can say that it is the text of a public book and not a party program.
The first country absorbed by Germany was Austria, and it was not part of Germany until World War I, nor was it taken away by the Treaty of Versailles. Is that correct?
For this reason, this provision was very clearly separated from the Versailles provisions in the program. Austria was directly linked to Versailles only because the right of self-determination proclaimed here was violated in the most flagrant manner. Austria and the purely German population were denied the Anschluss they wanted in 1918, after the revolution.
The second territory taken by Germany was Bohemia, then Moravia, and then Slovakia. They were not taken from Germany under the Treaty of Versailles, and they did not become part of Germany until World War I.
The same thing could be said of Austria as could be said of the Sudetenland. The German representatives of the Sudetenland sat in the Austrian parliament under the leadership of the leader Lottmann and voted the same way. The difference was in the case of the last action, namely the proclamation of the Protectorate. These parts of the Czech territory, especially Bohemia and Moravia, were not part of the small German Reich before the Treaty of Versailles, but had previously been part of the German Reich for centuries. This is a historical fact.
You never answered my question, although you answered something else. The Treaty of Versailles didn't take them away from you, did it?
Of course, Austria, as well as the Sudetenland, both territories, were taken away by the fact that neither in the Treaty of Versailles nor in the Treaty of Saint-Germain did they become German territories by virtue of the right of the people to self-determination. To that extent, that was the case.
You testified under questioning, did you not, that Hitler's information was that the United States would never go to war even if attacked, and that he was counting on the isolationists to prevent the country from going to war.
In general, this interrogation was recorded incorrectly. For this reason, I initially refused to take the oath until I was sure that the German transcript had been finally understood and translated correctly. Once, with the Russian delegation, I was given a completely correct translation of the transcript. I signed it page by page and authenticated it accordingly. Now, as regards this statement, I must clarify it. I said, first of all, that the Führer was not convinced that America would intervene in the war, and that he was convinced of this by the isolationist press. However, I objected, somewhat frightened, that America might intervene in the war from the beginning. It is nonsense, I hope you will forgive me, to say that America would not intervene even if it were attacked. You see, I never said nonsense because I realized that if a country was attacked, it would defend itself.
Did you know Axel Wennergren?
He's a Swede I've seen 2 or 3 times.
Have you had any conversations with him about this?
I probably did talk to him about the United States entering the war.
Did he tell you that democracy would not be able to mobilize and fight?
I did not tell you such nonsense. We had a democracy as our main enemy, England, and how this democracy can fight we knew from the last World War, and we experienced it again in the course of this war. When I spoke to Wennergren, the war with England was already underway.
You testified at the inquiry, if I understand you correctly, that there were 2 ideas constantly in Hitler's mind: to seek an alliance with Russia and to gain living space by acquiring colonies, or to make an alliance with Britain and seek acquisitions in the East. But given your preferences, would you have preferred an alliance with Britain? Is that true?
That's right. I only have to refer to the book Mein Kampf, where all these things are described by Hitler in detail.
Did you tell the tribunal that you, who were the second man in the Reich until 1943, knew nothing about the concentration camps?
First of all, I would like to say that I do not accept this document and that, in general, such words are not familiar to me. This paragraph strikes me as unusual. I know nothing about what happened or the methods used in the concentration camps later on, when I was not in charge.
Let me remind you of the evidence presented to the tribunal that 4 million people were exterminated in Auschwitz alone. Do you remember that?
It is a statement I have heard here, but I see no way of confirming it. I mean the figure.
If you do not consider this corroborated, let me remind you of the written testimony of Hottel, Deputy Head of the Foreign Department, Security Division 4 of the RSHA. He said that approximately 4 million Jews were murdered in concentration camps, and another 2 million died in other ways. Assuming that these figures, 1 Russian and 1 German, are convincing, even if we consider 50% of these figures, are you telling the court that a minister with his authority in the Reich could ignore such things?
I maintain that for this reason such things were kept secret from me. I should add that in my opinion not even the Führer knew to what extent this was going on. This also explains the fact that Himmler kept it secret. No figures or other details were ever sent to us.
Witness, but you had no access to the foreign press, to the press office of your ministry, or to foreign broadcasting. You know there is joint evidence that while Jews and other people were being deported, some 10 million people died of hypothermia, not counting those who died in combat. You say that you never heard about this in the foreign press or in broadcasts that mentioned that this was happening?
Firstly, the figure of 10 million has not been established in any way. Secondly, during the war, I did not read the foreign press because I considered it to be enemy propaganda. Thirdly, although I could have listened to foreign broadcasts, I did not do so because I did not want to listen to propaganda. I never listened to propaganda. It was only in the last 4 days of the war that I did so, and I can attest to this, listening to foreign broadcasts for the first time.
You told Mr. Jackson yesterday that there were several representatives in the Eastern Territories and that you had seen a film about the concentration camps at the beginning of the trial. Was that not correct? You were aware that millions of items of clothing, millions of shoes, 20,952 kilos of gold wedding rings, 35 wagon loads of furs, all of these were the property of people exterminated at Majdanek and Auschwitz. Didn't anyone tell you, under the 4-year plan, or anyone else, that they had this amount of human material? Do you remember that a Polish Jew testified that all that was left of his family, his wife and daughter, were bank cards? His job was to collect clothes. He told us that his friend Himmler's protégé said that killing a woman took 5 minutes longer because their hair had to be cut off to make mattresses. Did they never tell you about the savings in German material that killing people would bring?
No, and how could I imagine such a thing? I was outlining the general arrangements of the German economy, and I certainly did not include here the production of mattresses from women's hair or the recycling of old shoes and clothes. I leave the question open, but I object to the reference to me as Himmler's friend.
What shall I say? His enemy Himmler, or simply Himmler, whatever you prefer. You know what I mean, don't you?
Yes, exactly.
Now, I want to remind you of something else. Exhibit number USA 228, document number 407, VPS. I dutifully inform you that it was possible to provide 3,638,056 new overseas workers for the German war economy between April 1st of last year and March 31st of this year. In addition to the overseas civilian workers, 1,622,929 prisoners of war are involved in the German economy. Listen to this. About 5 million foreign workers came to Germany, not the 200,000 who came voluntarily. That's from the minutes of the Central Planning Commission on March 1st. You, in your position in the state as the architect of the German economy, are saying that you knew nothing about the 4.8 million foreign workers who were forced into labor. Is that what you are going to say to the court?
I never said that to the tribunal. I said that I knew very well that workers were brought in, and not always voluntarily. But although the figure of 200,000 is correct, I am not sure about the rest. The number of volunteers was large, but that does not invalidate the fact that a large number of workers were forced to work in the Reich. I have never denied this, and I have even confirmed it.
Do you admit, and I want this to be clear, that large numbers of workers were forced into forced labor in the Reich?
Yes, absolutely.
Sir David, do you wish to interrupt? Yes, sir. Do you remember what you said about the relationship between the Führer and you? I can repeat your words. The main influence on the Führer, at least until the end of 1941 or the beginning of 1942, if we are specifically talking about influence, was exerted by me. Then, from 1943 onwards, my influence gradually diminished, after which it declined rapidly. In general, I am not sure that anyone exerted the same influence on the Führer as I did. Is that your view on the matter?
Yes.
I think you told the tribunal that it was right for him to maintain his loyalty to the Führer to the end, right?
Correct.
Do you continue to justify and exalt Hitler even after he ordered the murder of 50 young officers in Stalag No. 3?
I am not here justifying or praising Führer Adolf Hitler. I am only emphasizing my loyalty to him because I am convinced that if an oath is not kept in good times, it is much more difficult to keep it in difficult times. As for the 50 airmen, I never opposed the Führer so clearly and forcefully as on this question, and I gave him my point of view on the matter. After that, I had no further discussions with the Führer.
The Führer, in any case, could know what was happening in the concentration camps, the treatment of the Jews, the treatment of the workers, right?
I have already mentioned that, in my opinion, the Führer did not know the details of the concentration camps and the atrocities described here. From what I knew of him, it does not seem to me that he was informed. But as he...
I'm not asking about the details, but about the murder of 4 or 5 million people. Are you suggesting that no one in power in Germany, with the exception of Himmler and probably Kaltenbrunner, knew about it?
I still share the opinion that the Führer was not aware of the figures given.
So you remember Mr. Deleuze describing the relationship between you and Hitler on page 53 of your book. From the beginning of our conversation, I resented your manner towards Göring, your best friend and comrade in years of struggle. Your desire to dominate was understandable, but to demand such civility from Göring, your closest comrade in arms, seemed repugnant to me. Is this how one should behave towards Hitler?
I was not required to behave like this, and I did not. These are journalistic statements by Mr. Deleuze made after the war. If Germany had won, the description would have been different.
That said, Mr. Deleuze is your witness.
Mr. Deleuze was not asked for his journalistic opinion. He was only asked about matters in which he acted as my messenger to the British government.
On matters of military strategy, who advised Hitler?
There were several people. On the basis of a purely departmental order, the 3 commanders-in-chief of the branches of the armed forces and their chiefs of staff were involved in the discussion of strategic questions. To some extent, the headquarters of the Operational Directorate, which reported directly to the Führer, was also involved.
Which of the accused can you name as such advisors?
When the Führer requested it, the strategic advisor was Colonel General Jodl, Chief of Staff for Operational Directorate. In matters of military organization, it was the 3 commanders-in-chief. Myself, Grand Admiral Roeder, and later Grand Admiral Dönitz. The last 2 were concerned with naval affairs. The other representatives of the army were not involved.
Couldn't all these advisers have been kept on the sidelines? Did they exert influence on Hitler's decisions with their advice and counsel?
If one leaves aside the purely formal point of view and assumes that it only deals with the military sphere, then the position was...
No, I mean all spheres. Issues of all kinds, such as economic, domestic, political, foreign policy, military and strategic. I mean, if we touch on the issue not theoretically but functionally, did your recommendations have a significant influence on Hitler's final decisions? That's what I mean by this.
To a certain extent, yes. His rejection depended on whether they affected the rights of the Führer.
You said to a certain extent, didn't you?
Yes, of course, if a reasonable offer was made, and if it seemed reasonable to him, it was probably used.
I maintain that all these advisers worked closely with Hitler. As a result, they had a certain influence on Hitler's final decisions. They did not stay out of the way, did they?
They were not on the sidelines, but they only had influence to the extent that their point of view coincided with that of the Führer.
Okay, let's move on to the next set of questions. When exactly did the German Air Force begin to develop a plan of action against the Soviet Union in connection with the Barbarossa variant?
The plan for the strategic concentration and deployment of air forces in connection with the Barbarossa variant was drawn up by my General Staff after the Führer's first indication of the possible outbreak of conflict, i.e. after the November indication.
1940.
In 1940. But in my camp, I'd already made preparations for a possible conflict with all those states that were not at war with us, including Russia. In my camp, I had thought it through, being completely independent.
So already in November 1940, that is, more than 6 months before the German attack on the Soviet Union, a plan for this attack had been drawn up with your participation?
I recently spoke at length about the fact that at that time a plan had already been drawn up for a possible change in the political situation in view of the Russian threat.
I ask you to briefly answer this question, yes or no. I repeat once again, in November 1940, more than 6 months before the attack on the Soviet Union, was the plan for this attack drawn up with your participation? Can you briefly answer this question?
Yes, but not in the way you want to present it.
I think I've put the question to you quite clearly, and there is no double meaning in it. How long did the Barbarossa plan take to develop?
What field are you referring to? The Air Force, the Navy, or the ground forces?
If you have knowledge in all areas, aviation, Navy, and ground forces, I would like you to answer in all areas.
In general, I can say about the Air Force, where things went relatively quickly.
Please, how long did it take to develop the Barbarossa plan?
I cannot give you the exact date without material, but in the Air Forces, the plan for strategic concentration and deployment was drawn up relatively quickly. In the field of ground forces, it obviously took longer.
So you admit that the attack against the Soviet Union was planned months before it was carried out, and that you, as commander of the German Air Force and Reichsmarschall, were directly involved in the preparation of this attack?
I will allow myself to point out the number of questions you have asked me. First of all, it was not a matter of a few months.
There is no abundance of questions here. There is one question. You admitted that in November you developed a variant of Barbarossa in the Air Forces. I ask you as Commander-in-Chief of the German Luftwaffe.
That's right.
You have answered the first part of the question. Now the last part, do you, as the Commander of the Air Forces and Reichsmarschall, admit that you participated in the preparation of the attack on the Soviet Union?
I repeat, I have made preparations for a possible attack, primarily because of Hitler's conviction that Soviet Russia was taking a dangerous attitude. Of course, there was no talk of an attack at the beginning, and this is clear from the directive of November 1940. I would like to emphasize that my position as Reichsmarschall plays no role in this case. It is only a title, a rank.
Do you not deny that this plan was drawn up as early as November 1940?
Yes.
It seems to me that this question has already been discussed in detail before, so there is no need to go into further detail about the Barbarossa plan, which is clear. I will move on to another question. Do you admit that the goals of the war against the Soviet Union were to seize Soviet territories up to the Urals, to annex the Baltic states, Crimea, the Caucasus, the Volga regions to the Reich, to subjugate Ukraine, Byelorusia, and other regions to Germany? Do you admit this?
I don't recognize it in any way.
Do you not remember that at the meeting with Hitler on July 16, 1941, at which you, Bormann, Keitel, Rosenberg and others were present, Hitler defined the aims of the war against the USSR in exactly the same way as I have said in the previous question, This document was submitted to the tribunal. It is quite well known, and you obviously remember it. Do you remember this meeting?
I remember this document exactly, and I remember this meeting very roughly. I said straight away that this document, drawn up by Herr Bormann, seemed to me to be infinitely exaggerated in terms of these demands. In any case, at the beginning of the war, and even before, this question was not discussed.
But you admit that such a protocol record exists?
I admit this because I have seen it. This document was drawn up by Bormann.
Do you acknowledge that, according to this transcript, you also participated in that meeting?
I was present at that meeting, and for that reason I doubted the accuracy of this record.
Do you remember that the minutes of the meeting formulated the tasks that were set in relation to the current situation? I will remind you of a few points from those minutes.
May I have a copy of these minutes?
Do you want a copy of the protocol?
I'm asking you.
So, summing up the answers you have given to my questions, it is quite clear, and I think you will agree with this, that the aims of the war were aggressive.
The sole and decisive objective was to eliminate the danger that Russia represented for Germany.
And seize Russian territories.
I will try to make it clear again. This was not discussed before the outbreak of the war. The answer is that the Führer saw Russia and the advance of its troops towards the border as a mortal threat to Germany, and he wanted to eliminate that threat. He felt it was his duty. What the world would have been like after a victorious war is another question that was not discussed at the time. But in answering your question, I did not mean to say that after a victorious war we would not have thought about annexation.
I do not want to waste the tribunal's time by returning to the question of the so-called preventive war, but at the same time, since the question has been raised, I must ask the following. Do you remember that in his testimony Marshal Milch stated that Göring never wanted war with Russia? Do you remember this testimony of your witness, Marshal Milch?
I remember it perfectly.
You remember? In that case, why did you not want war with Russia if you saw the so-called Russian threat?
First of all, I have already said that the Führer regarded such a danger as imminent. Secondly, in connection with the question put by my defense counsel, I have clearly and explicitly set out the reasons why I was convinced that it was not imminent and that we had to take preparatory measures. That is my conviction.
But you don't deny Milch's testimony.
Milch had a somewhat different opinion. He considered a two-front war to be a grave danger for Germany. He did not so much think that Russia was not a danger, but rather he believed that the danger was in taking the risk and going for a preemptive strike. I shared the same opinion, but at a certain point in time.
Please note paragraph 3 of this document. Political leaders of the troops are not considered prisoners and must be destroyed at the latest in transit camps. They will not be evacuated to the rear. Were you familiar with this directive?
Let me draw your attention to the fact that what we have before us is not a directive, but a reporting record signed by Warlimont. The list of recipients for the distribution of the document does not indicate any other service authority than the Department of National Defense. It is therefore a report record.
So you didn't know about this document?
This entry for the report is a record of the OKW Operational Command Staff. It is neither a directive nor an order. It is only an entry for the report.
That is not an answer to the question. Were you aware of this directive or not?
No, I didn't know anything about her.
Next, were the directives on the treatment of Soviet prisoners of war to be carried out in aviation units?
If they came from the Führer, yes. If they came from me, then yes.
Do you remember your directives on the treatment of Soviet prisoners of war?
No.
Tell me, most of these criminal OKW orders and directives were issued before the war against the Soviet Union began, in preparation for the war with the Soviet Union. Does this not prove that the German government and the OKW had a premeditated plan to destroy the Soviet population?
No, this does not prove that at all. It only proves that we viewed the struggle with the Soviet Union in this way. The fighting was extremely violent and was waged on the basis of other principles, as there were no agreements on the matter.
Tell me, are you familiar with the instructions given by Himmler in 1941 to exterminate 30 million Slavs? You also heard about this here at the trial of the witness Bakzelewski. Do you remember this testimony?
Yes, but it was not an order. It was just a speech. Secondly, it was Zelewski's conviction. And thirdly, all the speeches Himmler gave to his subordinates were kept in the strictest secrecy. In other words, it was a witness's statement of what he had heard, not an order. Later, he was not aware of such nonsense.
Tell me, did the German totalitarian state have a single leading centre, Hitler and his inner circle, including you as his deputy? The same directives had to apply to Himmler and Keitel. Could Himmler give instructions on the extermination of 30 million Slavs on his own, without Hitler's or your instructions on the matter?
Himmler did not give any order regarding the extermination of 30 million Slavs. Himmler made a speech to the effect that 30 million Slavs were to be exterminated. If Himmler had really issued such an order, he would have had to have asked the Führer about it if he had adhered to the decrees, but not me.
I did not say anything about the order. I said about Himmler's instructions, and you admit that Himmler could have given these instructions without consulting Hitler.
I note that such instructions could not have been given by Himmler. I am not aware of any such instructions or orders.
I repeat the question. Are not the OKW orders and directives on the treatment of the population and prisoners of war in the occupied Soviet territories and on the implementation of the General Directive on the extermination of the Slavs similar?
There has never been a directive given by the Führer or any other known party regarding the extermination of the Slavs.
You must have been aware of the mass extermination of Soviet citizens in the occupied Soviet territory with the help of the Einsatzgruppen, the security police and the SD. Were the activities of the Einsatzgruppen not the result of the implementation of a predetermined plan for the extermination of Jews, Slavs and other civilians?
No, the activities of the Einsatzgruppen were top secret.
I have a few more questions. Maybe we should break off now.
How long will this last, General Rudenko?
I'm thinking about another time.
I draw your attention to all these documents which you have submitted to the witness, and they are documents which have already been admitted into evidence and which speak for themselves. I therefore hope that you will conclude your cross-examination sooner.
Do you know that the German command ordered the use of Soviet prisoners of war and civilians for mine clearance and transporting unexploded shells, etc.? Do you know this?
I know that captured Russian sappers were used to clear minefields. I don't know to what extent civilians were used in this, but it is possible that this was the case.
Are you aware of the order to destroy Leningrad, Moscow and other cities of the Soviet Union?
In my presence, the destruction of Leningrad was only mentioned in the document cited, and in the sense that if the Finns got Leningrad, they would not need such a big city. I know nothing about the destruction of Moscow.
Do you remember the minutes of the meeting? You were shown a document, the minutes of July 16th, 1941. You were present at this meeting.
It would be nice if you could introduce me to them and see if they look familiar.
I have no intention of handing over these documents to you. They have already been submitted to the court. I am interested to know whether you were aware of these orders.
I did not receive the order to destroy Leningrad and Moscow in the sense that you indicate.
You were only informed about important things. And the destruction of cities, the murder of millions of people, did they go through the so-called official authorities?
If any city had to be destroyed by bombing, such an order would be given directly by me.
On March 8th here at the court session, your witness Bodenschatz stated that you told him in March 1945 that many Jews had been murdered and that a heavy price would have to be paid for this. Do you remember this statement by your witness?
As it was translated to me, I do not remember. Witness Bodenschatz did not say that. I asked to see the minutes of the meeting.
And as witness Bodenschatz said, do you remember?
He said that if the war was lost, it would cost us a lot of money.
Why? Because of the murders he committed?
No, not at all, and we saw it for ourselves.
I have a few final questions for you. First of all, about the so-called theory of the superior race. In this connection, I only put one question to you and ask you to answer it directly. Do you agree or disagree with this theory of a superior race and the education of the German people in its spirit?
No, I have already shown that I have never used this expression in my articles or speeches. I do recognize the differences between races.
But you do not agree with this theory. Is that how I understand you?
I have never intended to place one race as superior to another. I have merely pointed out the differences between the races.
But can you answer me one question? Do you disagree with this theory?
Personally, I don't think that's right.
Next question. You testified at the trial that you allegedly disagreed with Hitler on the conquest of Czechoslovakia, on the Jewish question, on the question of war with the Soviet Union, on the assessment of the theory of the superior race, on the question of the shooting of British prisoner-of-war pilots. How do you explain that in the presence of such serious differences, you considered it possible to cooperate with Hitler and follow his policy?
Here we must distinguish between different periods of time. At the time of the offensive against Russia, it was not a question of differences of principle, but of differences of question, of time.
You have already said that. I ask you to answer my question.
I may disagree with my Supreme Commander, I can clearly state my opinion, but if the Commander-in-Chief insists on his opinion, and I have sworn to him, then the discussion is over.
You are not a simple soldier, as you have said here. You have also presented yourself here as a statesman.
I am not only a private soldier, and precisely because I am not a private soldier, but held such an important position, I had to set an example for the private soldiers in fulfilling the oath.
In other words, did you consider it possible in the presence of these differences to cooperate with Hitler?
I have insisted on this, and I believe it is correct. My oath was not only for good times, but also for bad times, although the Führer never threatened me and never told me that he was worried about my health.
If you considered it possible to collaborate with Hitler, do you, as the second person in Germany, consider yourself responsible for the organized and state-sponsored murders of millions of innocent people, even independently of your knowledge of these facts? Please answer briefly, yes or no.
No, because I knew nothing about them and did not order them to be carried out.
I repeat, even independently of knowledge of these facts.
If I don't really know them, I can't be responsible for them.
Was he obliged to know these facts?
It must be resolved.
I ask you, answer the question. Was it your duty to know these facts?
In what sense am I obliged? Either I know the facts or I don't. At most, you can ask me whether I was frivolous because I did not try to find out anything about them.
You should know yourself better. Millions of Germans knew about the crimes that were being committed, but you did not.
Millions of Germans did not know this. This statement is not supported by anything.
You testified at the trial that Hitler's government led Germany to prosperity. Are you still convinced that this is true?
Before the war, yes. The catastrophe only came after the war was lost.
As a result of which you led Germany to military and political defeat. I have no further questions.
Does the French prosecutor wish to ask any questions? I ask the court to authorize me to make a very brief statement. You can be sure that you will have the opportunity to comment on this later, but I am now finding out whether there will be any questions from you. Mr. President, I conclude. The French prosecution considers that the arguments put forward by the defense of the accused Göring have not in the least succeeded in disproving the evidence provided. You can be sure that you will have the opportunity to comment on this later, but I am now finding out whether there will be any questions from you. Mr. President, I conclude. The French prosecution considers that the arguments put forward by the defense of the accused Göring have not in the slightest succeeded in undermining the evidence provided. The indisputable evidence and allegations that we have put forward have not been shaken by what has been put forward by the defense. Therefore, I have no new questions that I would like to put to the accused.
The British prosecution alleges that you gave direct orders to the Hermann Göring division during its operations in Italy against the partisans. Is this accusation correct?
The Hermann Göring division was a land division and was part of the active units of the army and the army group. Consequently, it never received tactical action orders from me, from Berlin, or from my headquarters, which were not involved. Consequently, I could not give orders to fight the partisans, only orders that concerned personnel and equipment issues, or internal justice against officers, but the division did not submit daily reports to me.
I didn't hear you. I'm sorry, Your Honor, I should have spoken earlier. I refer these questions to the Hermann Göring division. The accused was not questioned in the main examination on this matter, and consequently I did not mention it in the cross-examination because the issue was not raised. Therefore, it seems to me inadmissible to raise the issue in this cross-examination. You will remember, Sir David, that the practice in foreign countries is not the same as in the United States and England, and while it is perfectly understandable that Dr. Stamer cannot, under the rules of England, at any time raise this issue in cross-examination, we are governed by a law which does not technically deal with all issues of evidence. I may have to ask him some questions after cross-examination, although I hope that will not be necessary in view of the evidence of the witness Kesselring. I am aware of that, but I just want to clarify that the prosecution did not address the issue at all because it had not been raised previously. No, neither in questioning nor in cross-examination, or in the interrogation. Sir David, I have already pointed out that the issue was not raised in Hermann Göring's testimony.
Let me, by way of explanation, say that I did not receive the document until yesterday, and consequently I was unable to form a position on this issue, which has already been raised by the prosecution.
But if my memory serves me right, the witness, Field Marshal Kesselring himself, put the question, and therefore the question was obvious and could have been asked in the course of the main question concerning the accused Göring. He did not refer to a specific document. He relied on the testimony of Field Marshal Kesselring, who said that he was excluded, I think that is how it was translated, that he was excluded between the Hermann Göring division and the accused Göring, although the Hermann Göring division was under his command. But there was no documentation on that.
The witness may continue, Mr. President.
Yes.
The division under my command was only in terms of personnel, officers and equipment, but not in terms of participation. I did not receive daily reports, but at intervals as to events, losses, movements. In general, this was the kind of communication I had with the division. I could not give orders for its use in combat, as I was under the authority of the army.
Did you receive any report on the events in Civitello?
No, I did not receive such a report. I first learned of it here from an affidavit by an army general under whose command the division was, and who was responsible for such matters, and who is trying to transfer responsibility for the division to me, since it bore my name.
Your attitude towards Hitler and your influence on him have been mentioned again in the interrogation. Could you please summarize the facts concerning the individual periods which are necessary to form an opinion on this relationship?
I pointed out during cross-examination that a long period should be taken into account. In 1923, when I was head of the SA, my attitude was normal. Then, for a long time, 1931...
With the permission of the court, it seems to me that the interests of time conflict with the admissibility of the witness to summarize. He has been given the benefit of answering any questions for as long as he wants. It seems to me that when he brings up the issue again, and the question has already been raised 4 or 5 times in the questions put to him, this should have already exhausted the issue. The question of time is complex. According to our calculations, careful calculations, taking into account the witnesses, the trial will last until August. We cannot allow him to play his game this way, making speeches in cross-examination and then summarizing them. Dr. Stamer, the tribunal has permitted you to ask questions which, broadly speaking, are not permitted in re-examination, and I want to make it clear to you that the questions permitted in this re-examination are only those arising from cross-examination. On this issue, the accused Göring was allowed to make real speeches in the main questioning without interruption, and he covered the whole history of the Nazi regime up to the end of the war. The tribunal does not consider that he is free to continue in the same vein in this new questioning.
Mr. President, I simply ask the question because it has not been dealt with in depth so far, and I believe that a thorough and complete examination of this question, which I consider important for the judgment of this court, is necessary in order to form an opinion on the attitude of the defendant at this stage. However, if the court objects to the question, I can agree with the judgment and withdraw the question. I have another question. During your interrogation, you stated, in relation to certain charges, that you admitted your responsibility for them. How can that be understood?
As regards responsibility, one must distinguish between formal responsibility and actual responsibility. Formally, I am responsible for what happened in my departments and institutions under my command. Although I could not see or know in advance what was adopted or discussed in them, I can nevertheless assume formal responsibility, especially if it concerns general directives given by me. I see real responsibility in those cases where I personally gave orders or directives, including in particular all actions and acts that I personally signed or personally accepted. But I want to say, the fact is that not many general words and statements have been said by me in a narrow circle in 25 years. In particular, I want to say very clearly about responsibility, the Führer, Adolf Hitler, is dead. I was considered his successor in the German Reich. Accordingly, I declare that as far as my responsibility is concerned, my aim was—
The court does not want you to make speeches. The court is well aware of the distinction between formal and actual liability in its decisions.
I am conscious of my responsibility to carry out the preparations for the seizure of power and to establish a firm authority to make Germany free and great. I did everything possible to prevent war. But once it began, it was my duty to do everything possible for victory.
We have heard you speak about this more than once, and we are not going to hear it again.
On the question of labour, during the war, the population of the occupied territories was brought to work in Germany, and their countries were economically exploited.
Dr. Stamer, you were going to ask the witness. So what was the answer to that question?
I was asking about responsibility.
You may ask questions, but not general questions involving speeches. If you have individual questions arising from cross-examination, please ask them.
I raised the question, to what extent does one take responsibility in the interrogation of the deportation of workers?
I object to this question. You have spoken about this before. You have responded to it more than once.
In that case, I have no further questions.
Good. Then the accused may return.